Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. It was meant to be a simple, happy journey, the kind people don't think twice about. A group of 7 people set out together in a van heading toward an engagement. There was probably laughter at the start, maybe small conversations, plans for when they would arrive, thoughts about the people they were going to meet. It was just another drive, nothing unusual, nothing that felt dangerous. The road they were on was long and quiet, stretching out through empty areas where there wasn't much around. Those kinds of roads can feel peaceful at first, but they also have a way of making everything slow down. The steady movement of the van, the lack of traffic, the same scenery repeating again and again, it all creates a kind of silence that makes people tired without them even realizing it. The driver had been driving for a while. At some point, that tiredness started to take over. Maybe his eyes felt heavy. Maybe he tried to fight it for a few moments, but it only takes a second for control to slip. And that's all it was, a moment. His eyes closed. The van kept moving. When he woke up, it must have been sudden, like being pulled back into reality too quickly. In that instant, he realized something was wrong. The van was no longer steady. It had drifted, lost direction, and was now out of his control. Those few seconds must have felt stretched, like everything was happening too fast and too slow at the same time. He had a choice to make. Inside the van, there were 6 other people who trusted him to get them safely to their destination. But in that moment of panic, fear took over. Instead of trying to regain control, instead of trying to correct the path, he made a decision that would change everything. He opened his door and jumped out. What happened next was beyond anyone's control. The van, now completely unmanaged, continued forward before running off the road. It hit uneven ground, lost balance, and began to roll. Metal twisted violently. Glass shattered into countless sharp pieces, and everything inside was thrown around without any protection. There was no time to react. No way to brace, no way to escape. For 4 people, it ended right there. Their lives were taken in that single violent moment, without warning, without preparation, on a road that had seemed so ordinary just minutes before. One person survived with minor fractures. Somehow, through positioning or chance, they escaped the worst of it. It's the kind of outcome that doesn't always make sense. How one person can come out with less harm, while others suffer so much more. Sometimes it's just where they were sitting, how the vehicle moved, how the impact landed. And then there was your mother. She survived, but her body had taken the full force of the crash. Her injuries were severe, far beyond what most people ever experience. Her skull had been cracked, the bones under her eyes were broken and pushed inward, changing the structure of her face. Glass from the shattered windows had lodged into her eyes, adding another level of damage that doctors would have to carefully deal with. Her nose was broken. Her jaw was shattered. Her teeth had fallen out from the impact. Her shoulder bone was broken and dislocated. Her hip fractured, her toes broken. A large section of skin on her foot had been torn away, leaving a deep and painful wound. This wasn't just survival. It was survival at the edge of what the human body can endure. She was rushed to the hospital, where everything moved quickly but carefully. Doctors and surgeons worked to stabilize her, to stop the damage from getting worse, to begin the long process of trying to repair what could be repaired. Surgery after surgery followed, each one focused on a different part of her body, trying to rebuild, to fix, to give her a chance not just to live, but to recover. In moments like that, people often need something to hold on to, something stronger than pain, stronger than fear. For her, it was her children. She later said that the only thing that kept her going was the thought that her kids would grow up without a mother if she gave up. That thought stayed with her through everything, through every painful procedure, through every moment where things must have felt unbearable. It gave her a reason to keep fighting. When you saw her after the surgeries, it must have been something you weren't ready for. You were only 9 or 10 years old. At that age, your understanding of the world is still forming. You know your parents as strong, familiar, unchanging figures. Seeing your mother like that would have felt like something impossible. She was completely covered in bandages, layer upon layer wrapped around her body, her face, almost everything hidden beneath white cloth. She looked like someone erased, like a person turned into something unrecognizable. Only small gaps were left, openings for her eyes, a small space for her lips. That image is something a child's mind tries to make sense of in its own way. It doesn't process it as a medical situation. It turns it into something almost unreal, something closer to an image from a story than real life. But it was real. It was your mother. She couldn't speak for months. Her jaw and face needed time to heal, and until then, her voice was gone. Communication became difficult, limited to gestures, expressions, whatever small movements she could manage. She couldn't walk for a year. That meant a long period of recovery, of learning to move again, of slowly rebuilding strength in a body that had been through something extreme. Every step forward would have taken effort, patience, and pain. And during all of this, you were there, watching, trying to understand in your own way what had happened. At that age, you may not have fully grasped the seriousness of it. You saw the bandages, the stillness, the changes, but the deeper meaning, how close everything had come to a different outcome, likely came later. That's how these memories work. They don't fully form at the time. They grow over time, gaining meaning as you gain understanding. Now, looking back, you can see it more clearly. You can see how fragile that moment was, how easily things could have gone another way, how close you came to losing her. And that's where the fear comes from now. Not from what you felt then, but from what you understand now. The image of her wrapped in bandages, like someone hidden from the world, is what stayed the strongest. It's the part your mind held onto, the part it couldn't fully process and therefore never fully let go. That's why it shows up in your dreams. Dreams often bring back images that carry strong emotion, but were never completely understood. They replay them, not to harm you, but because your mind is still trying to make sense of them. That image became a symbol of something bigger, not just injury, not just survival, but the possibility of loss. Even though she made it through, even though she recovered, your mind still holds on to that moment where everything was uncertain, where the outcome wasn't guaranteed. That's what lingers. But there's another part to the story that is just as real, even if it doesn't appear in those dreams as often. She survived. She went through something extreme, something that could have ended her life, and still came back from it. Through surgeries, pain, months without speaking, a year without walking, she kept going. And she did it because of you and your siblings. That doesn't erase the memory or the way it feels, but it adds something to it. It means that the story doesn't end with that image of her in bandages. It continues beyond it, into recovery, into strength, into the fact that despite everything, she was still there, and she still is. It was late at night when my mom's best friend was driving home from work. The kind of drive that feels almost automatic after you've done it enough times. The roads were quiet, with only a few cars passing by now and then, and the street lights were spaced out just enough to leave parts of the road in shadow. There was nothing unusual about the night. It felt calm, predictable, and safe in the way familiar routines usually do. She had taken that same route many times before, so her mind wasn't on anything specific. Just getting home, maybe thinking about the day, maybe already starting to unwind. Everything felt normal. Then she noticed flashing lights behind her. It was sudden enough to make her heart skip for a second, the way it always does when you see police lights unexpectedly. Even if you know you haven't done anything wrong, there's still that instinctive reaction. But she didn't panic. She assumed it was something small, something simple. Maybe a tail light had gone out. Maybe she had missed something minor. It happens. So she slowed down, pulled over to the side of the road, and waited. The area she stopped in was quiet. No other cars nearby, no houses close enough to notice anything. Just her car, the flashing lights behind her, and the silence of the night. A man stepped out of the car behind her. He was wearing a police uniform. At first, everything followed the pattern people are used to. He walked up to her window calmly, his movements controlled, his voice steady. He told her that her tail light was out and asked for her license and registration. It sounded normal, routine, exactly what you would expect in that situation. She didn't hesitate. She handed over her documents, trusting what she was seeing. There was no reason not to. He looked like a police officer, acted like one, and the situation felt familiar enough that her guard stayed down. He took her information and walked back to his car. She sat there, waiting. At first, the wait felt normal. These things can take a few minutes. You sit in your car, watch the lights reflecting off the road, maybe check the time, maybe just wait quietly. But as the minutes passed, something about it started to feel off. It was taking longer than expected. There was nothing to do but sit there and wait, and that kind of waiting slowly becomes uncomfortable. You start to notice the silence more, the isolation, the fact that you're alone on a dark road with someone you don't know. Eventually, he came back, at first. Now, the questions didn't seem unusual. He asked where she was coming from, where she was going. Basic questions, the kind that might come up during a stop. She answered without thinking too much about it. But then the tone of the conversation shifted. The questions became more personal. He asked if she had a husband at home, if she had children, if there were any weapons in the house, if she had daughters, if she had aggressive pets. Each question felt more out of place than the last. At first, she might have tried to brush it off, thinking there was some reason behind it that she didn't understand. But the more he asked, the clearer it became that something wasn't right. None of those questions had anything to do with a broken taillight. The discomfort started to grow into something stronger, so she spoke up. She told him that those questions were inappropriate, that they didn't make sense in this situation. The reaction was immediate. His entire demeanor changed. The calm, controlled tone disappeared, replaced by something sharp and aggressive. His voice got louder, harsher. He snapped at her, reminding her that he was a cop, that she needed to listen, that she didn't have a choice. The shift was so sudden that it made everything feel unstable. Then he told her to step out of the car. That's when the situation became real. Up until that point, there had been doubt, confusion, maybe even a hope that there was some explanation. But in that moment, something inside her told her clearly that this was not safe. Instead of opening the door, she rolled up her window. It was a small action, but it gave her a sense of control. Inside the car, she started searching for her phone, her hands moving quickly, her thoughts racing. Her body had shifted fully into fear now, the kind that doesn't leave room for hesitation. Outside, the man lost whatever calm he had been pretending to have. He became violent. He started hitting the window hard, the sound of it sharp and sudden in the quiet night. The glass shook under the force of his blows. He grabbed the door handle, pulling at it, trying to force it open. He was yelling now, shouting things that didn't sound anything like what a real officer would say. The words were angry, threatening, completely uncontrolled. At that point, there was no doubt left. This wasn't a police officer. This was someone pretending, someone dangerous. She had to decide what to do. Staying there no longer felt like an option. So she pressed the gas and drove away. It wasn't a calm, planned decision. It was instinct, survival. The kind of reaction that comes from a place deeper than thought, where your body moves before your mind fully catches up. The car behind her followed. The flashing lights stayed on, and for a short time, it became a chase. The empty road that had felt quiet and safe just moments ago now felt like something completely different. Every second stretched out. Every glance in the mirror brought a new wave of fear. She kept driving, focused only on getting away, on reaching somewhere safer, somewhere visible. As she got closer to a main road where there would be more cars, more lights, more people, something changed. The car behind her slowed. Then it stopped following. Just like that, it was over. Whoever he was, he didn't want attention. He didn't want to be seen. His control depended on isolation, on being alone with his target. Once that was gone, he gave up. She didn't stop. She kept driving until the distance felt real, until the fear started to loosen its grip, just enough for her to think clearly again. Then she called 911. When she explained what had happened, expecting some kind of explanation, something that might make it less terrifying, she got the truth instead. There were no officers in that area. No one had pulled her over. The man she had just encountered was not a police officer. That realization changed everything. What had already been frightening became something much worse. Every detail of the encounter now had a different meaning. The questions, the behavior, the aggression, it all fit together in a way that made sense, but in the worst possible way. In the days that followed, more information came out. There was a man in the area pretending to be a police officer. He had been targeting women. He was a rapist. The questions he had asked that night were not random. They were deliberate. He was trying to understand her situation, to figure out if she was alone, if anyone would be waiting for her, if there was anything that could stop him. He already seemed to know things about her, which made it even more disturbing. Her address, details about her life. That meant it wasn't just a random encounter. He had chosen her. And the tail light? There had never been anything wrong with it. It was just a way to make her stop. After that night, things changed for her. Even though she escaped, even though nothing physical happened, the fear stayed. Knowing how close it had been, how easily it could have gone differently, it became something she carried with her. She became more careful, more aware of her surroundings. She didn't trust situations as easily as before. She took steps to protect herself, to make sure she would never be that vulnerable again. But even with all that, the memory didn't disappear. It stayed in the background, a reminder of how normal something can feel at first, and how quickly it can turn into something else entirely. I got called out to a caravan park late at night after reports finally came in about a woman screaming from one of the units. From what we were told, people had been hearing her for most of the day, but no one had actually called it in until that night. That part always stayed with me because it meant whatever was happening inside that place had been going on for hours while everyone around just listened and waited. My partner and I arrived and made our way through the rows of caravans. It was quiet in that uneasy way those places can be at night. A few lights on here and there, shadows stretching across narrow walkways, everything feeling a little too still. We found the one we were looking for and knocked on the door. It opened almost right away. A big man stood there, easily towering over me. He positioned himself in the doorway in a way that completely blocked my view inside. I couldn't see anything past him. Not the room, not who else was there, nothing at all. Just him filling the entire entrance. He smiled and greeted us like we were just visitors. There was nothing aggressive about him. No anger, no panic, nothing that would immediately set off alarms. He was calm, polite, even friendly. The kind of person most people would feel comfortable talking to without a second thought. I told him we'd had complaints about a woman screaming from this address. He didn't hesitate for a second. He had an answer ready, like he'd been expecting the question. He said it was just him and his wife arguing. Something about an item being stolen from outside, and according to him, it was her fault. He said it so casually. Like it was nothing more than a normal domestic argument that had gotten a bit loud. It didn't sit right. There was something about how quickly he explained it, how smooth it sounded, like it had already been thought through. But at the same time, on the surface, it wasn't enough to act on. People argue. People shout. That alone doesn't give you grounds to go further. Still, I wasn't going to leave without seeing her. That's part of the job. You don't just take someone's word for it. You make sure everyone is actually okay before walking away. I told him I needed to check on her. That's when I saw the first crack in his calm behavior. It was small, just a moment of hesitation. But it was there. He paused like he was deciding whether to push back or not. Then he stepped aside. I walked in and saw her sitting on the bed. She was completely covered, head to toe, in layers of clothing, which was strange on its own. On top of that, she was wearing large sunglasses, even though it was night and the room was dim. It didn't match the situation at all. At first, a few possibilities crossed my mind. Drugs, maybe, someone trying to hide something. But the way she sat there, quiet and still, didn't feel like that. I asked if she was okay. She nodded. That was it. No words, no eye contact, no movement other than that small nod. I asked again, trying to get a clearer response, but it was the same. She kept the glasses on and didn't say anything. Legally, I couldn't force her to remove them or speak. So with nothing solid to act on in that moment, I gave them a warning about the noise and told them to keep things down. We stepped outside, but something stayed with me. It didn't feel finished. The way he had blocked the door, the way she was covered up, the silence. It all felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully prove yet, but I couldn't ignore it either. Instead of leaving, I went next door. I knocked and asked the neighbors if they had seen or heard anything. Their response changed everything. They told me the woman next door was covered in bruises. They had seen her before and knew something wasn't right. They said she needed help and agreed to give statements. That was enough. We went back. This time there was no waiting. I arrested the man and put him in the back of the car. He didn't resist. He stayed calm the entire time, still polite, still composed, like nothing serious was happening. That calmness made it worse. Once he was secured, I went back inside to help her. As soon as she tried to stand, she collapsed. Her body couldn't hold her up. We helped her back onto the bed, and that's when she started removing the layers she had been hiding under. The clothes came off, then the glasses. And what was underneath is something I will never forget. Her entire body was covered in bruises, deep, dark marks everywhere, showing repeated violence over time. Her face was swollen, both eyes blackened so badly it was hard to see her features clearly. There were burns on her legs and stomach, fresh burns. There were wounds all over her body, small but deep, like they had been made with something sharp. Later, it was clear they were from a screwdriver, and many of them were infected. I had never seen anything like it. This wasn't one incident. This had been happening over and over again. She had been tied up in that caravan, Mom held there and tortured for weeks. Weeks of it. And all of it hidden behind that door, behind that man who had just stood there smiling and talking like everything was normal. That's the part that stays with me the most. Not just what he did, but how he acted. How easy it would have been to believe him and walk away. How normal he seemed in that first moment. You don't really know who someone is just from how they present themselves. Sometimes the worst people are the ones who seem the easiest to trust. We got her out of there. She was taken to hospital and later moved into a safe place where she could start recovering. It wasn't going to be quick or easy, but she had a chance now. He didn't get away with it. We built the case, and he was put away for life without bail. That should have been the end of it. But there's one part that never leaves me. Even after everything he had done, everything she had been through, she still asked about him. She wanted to know if she would ever see him again. That's the part that people don't understand until they see it themselves. When someone is controlled, isolated, and hurt over time, it changes how they think and feel. The person hurting them becomes the center of everything, even when it doesn't make sense. It creates a bond that looks impossible from the outside. But it's real. That whole experience stays with you. Not just the injuries, not just what happened inside that caravan, but the realization that someone can hide something that extreme behind a normal face and a friendly voice. And you only see the truth when it's almost too late. It changes the way you see the world when you grow up, knowing that someone can be both things at once. Not in a small way, but in a deep, permanent way that quietly sits in the background of how you judge people, how you listen to them, how you trust them. Because once you've seen that split clearly, you can't go back to believing that people are only what they show on the surface. From the outside, it never makes sense at first. How someone who is kind, funny, generous, the kind of person everyone likes, can also be the same person who creates the kind of fear that stays with you at night. It feels like those two versions shouldn't be able to exist in the same body. But the truth is, sometimes they do. And that's what makes it so hard to understand. When you were very young, you were already in the middle of something like that, even if you didn't have the awareness at the time to fully process it. At that age, you don't question the environment around you. You accept it as normal, even when it isn't. The patterns, the tension, the sudden changes in mood, all of it just becomes part of the background of life. Your father coming home drunk that night was not unusual. It had happened before, enough times that it followed a pattern your mother already knew. There's often a buildup in those situations, a shift in energy that starts small and then grows. Voices get louder, words get sharper, and what begins as an argument turns into something much more dangerous. That night, it started with shouting. He was yelling at her, calling her names, saying things meant to hurt and break her down. Those words alone can leave marks that don't fade easily. But that was only the beginning. The coffee table being flipped, the sound of it hitting the floor, everything scattered. That's the moment where the situation moves from anger into something physical. And then he pulled the phone cord from the wall. That detail is important because it shows intent. It wasn't just about anger. It was about control. Removing the ability to call for help, cutting off any outside connection, making sure that what was about to happen stayed contained inside those walls. After that, he started hitting her. Not just once, not something that ended quickly, but something that continued, building in intensity. The kind of violence that doesn't stop easily. The kind that leaves someone feeling trapped with no clear way out. Then it escalated even further. He grabbed her and started slamming her head against the wall, over and over again. She described it later as feeling like her head was flattening from the force and repetition. That's how extreme it was. That's how far it had gone. In that moment, she truly believed she might not survive it. That's a level of fear that stays with a person. And in the middle of all of that, something unexpected happened. You were there, a small child, not understanding what was going on. To you, the phone cord was just something that belonged in a certain place. It had been pulled out, and without thinking, you picked it up and plugged it back into the wall. There was no intention behind it, no plan, just a simple action. But the moment it connected, the phone rang. It was your grandmother calling. And just like that, everything changed. Your father stopped immediately. Not slowly, not in stages, but completely. It was like a switch had been flipped. 1 second, he was in the middle of extreme violence, and the next he was walking over to answer the phone like nothing had happened. He spoke calmly, normally. There was no anger in his voice, no sign of what had just taken place seconds earlier. He carried on a conversation, listened, responded, as if he had just come home from a regular day and nothing more. When he hung up, he turned to your mother and spoke to her in a calm, almost caring tone. He told her that her parents were coming over and that they needed to clean everything up. That shift is what stays with you. Not just the violence, but the control behind it. The ability to move in and out of that state so quickly. It shows that it wasn't something completely uncontrollable. It was something he could step away from when he needed to, especially when someone else might see what was happening. From the outside, he was a good person. That's what makes it more confusing. He was friendly, helpful, the kind of person people trusted. He could make people laugh, make them feel comfortable, offer help without expecting anything back. If someone met him without knowing the full story, they would never suspect what he was capable of. That's how it works in many of these situations. If someone was cruel all the time, it would be easier to see, easier to leave, easier for others to believe. But when there are good moments mixed in, when there are apologies, gifts, kind words, it creates confusion. It makes people hold on to the version of the person they want to believe is real. Your father wasn't one thing all the time. He was both. There were moments where he was kind, where he showed love, where things felt normal or even good. And then there were moments where that changed completely. That contrast is what keeps people caught in it. The hope that the good version is the real one, that the bad moments are temporary, that things can go back to how they were. That's why people stay longer than others expect. It's not just fear. It's the mixture of fear and attachment, harm and comfort, all tied together in a way that's hard to separate. Growing up around that changes how you see people. You learn early that what someone shows on the outside doesn't always match what's underneath. You become more aware, more cautious, more observant. You notice things that others might miss. You don't fully trust first impressions the same way. That awareness can feel like a burden sometimes, but it also comes from something real. You've seen the difference between appearance and reality. The part about your mother still thanking you years later adds something powerful to the story. At the time, you didn't know what you were doing. You were just interacting with something familiar, fixing something that seemed out of place. But that small action changed the situation. It interrupted what was happening, created a break, and brought someone else into the moment through that phone call. It shifted the direction of that night in a way that mattered. Even if you don't remember it, the impact of it is still there. For your mother, it wasn't just a small moment. It was something that helped her survive that night. And that meaning doesn't fade. What you said about the nice guy appearance is also important. That ability to seem normal, kind, even charming, is part of how people like that avoid suspicion. It's how they build trust, how they keep people close, how they continue what they're doing without being stopped. If they didn't have that side, they wouldn't get away with it for as long as they do. The compliments, the apologies, the promises, those aren't always fake. Sometimes they are real in that moment, and that's what makes it harder to leave, harder to separate the person from their actions. It creates a cycle, and from the outside, it's easy to ask why someone stays, but from the inside, it's much more complicated. What stands out most in your story isn't just what happened, but how clearly you understand it now. You've taken something confusing and painful and made sense of it in a way that many people struggle to do. And even though you were just a toddler, that moment you described had a real impact. It changed what could have been the outcome of that night, and that's something that stays, even if the memory itself doesn't. I used to work at an animal hospital in Las Vegas, and for the most part, I genuinely loved the job. It was the kind of place where every day felt a little different, but in a good way. You were always busy, always moving, always dealing with animals and their owners. And there was a sense that what you were doing actually mattered. Even on the harder days, it felt worth it. My role involved doing rounds and checking on animals, making sure everything was running smoothly between different parts of the facility. There were multiple buildings, and communication between staff mostly happened over radios. It wasn't a perfect system. There was always some kind of static or feedback, random noises cutting in and out, so you learned pretty quickly not to overreact to every strange sound that came through. That's why at first, I didn't think much of it. I was out doing my usual rounds when something came over the radio. It was short, almost too short to catch clearly, just a burst of sound mixed in with the usual static. But there was something about it that didn't feel like the normal interference we were used to. It sounded like someone screaming. There was also a dog barking in the background. It lasted maybe a second or two, and then it was gone. I stopped walking for a moment, just standing there, trying to process what I had heard. Part of me thought maybe I imagined it. The radios picked up all kinds of weird noises sometimes, and it would have been easy to dismiss it as just another glitch. But something about it stuck with me. It didn't feel like random noise, it felt real. I decided to check it out. I jogged over to the main treatment building first. That was usually where most of the activity happened. So if something was wrong, that would be the most likely place. I walked in and looked around, expecting to see some kind of chaos or at least signs that something had gone wrong. But everything looked normal. No one was panicking. No one was shouting. People were just going about their work like it was any other day. It made me second-guess myself for a moment. Maybe I had misheard it. Maybe it really was just interference. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Next, I headed toward the luxury boarding building. That's where my boss, Gabby, usually was. Compared to the treatment area, that building was quieter, more isolated. If something had happened there, it might not have been obvious from the outside. When I got there, it was silent. Too silent. No barking, no voices, nothing out of place at first glance. Anyone else might have stopped there and assumed everything was fine. There was no clear sign that anything was wrong, but that feeling was still there, so I kept going. I walked further down the hallway toward the back, where Gabby would usually be working. Each step felt heavier, like my body already knew something my mind hadn't fully accepted yet. When I reached the end of the hall, I stopped in front of a door with a small plexiglass window. I leaned in and looked through. The first thing I saw was blood. It was smeared across the walls. For a split second, my brain didn't process it properly. It was so out of place, so unexpected, that it didn't feel real. Just a red smear that didn't belong there. Then everything clicked. I froze for a second, then pushed the door open and rushed inside. There was blood everywhere. On the walls, on the floor, across the countertops, smeared over the doors. It looked like something had exploded, like the room had been turned into a scene of pure chaos. And in the middle of it all was Gabby. She was a small woman, maybe 120 pounds, standing between two pit bulls that were locked onto each other, fighting with everything they had. It wasn't a scuffle. It wasn't something you could break up with a quick intervention. They were trying to kill each other. Their jaws were clamped down, bodies tense, completely focused on tearing into one another. Gabby was trying to pull them apart, slipping on the blood that covered the floor, struggling to keep her footing while putting herself right in the middle of it. There was no hesitation at that point. I moved in and grabbed the dog that seemed to be the aggressor from behind, reaching for its collar. Gabby grabbed the other one, trying to pull it away at the same time. It didn't work. They were locked in, completely unresponsive to anything else. The kind of grip that doesn't just release because someone is pulling. I started yelling into the radio, calling for help. I don't even remember exactly what I said, just shouting that we needed help, that there was an emergency, that we needed people there immediately. I kept yelling for what felt like a long time, but in reality, it was probably only around 10 seconds. No one came. No one responded. I had to drop the radio and focus on the fight again. The aggressor unclamped its jaws for a split second, then bit down again, harder, locking onto the other dog's neck. The sound alone was enough to tell how bad it was. I realized in that moment that we were out of time. There was no help coming, and if we didn't do something immediately, one of these dogs was going to die right there. I looked around the room, searching for anything that could help. That's when I saw it. A heavy metal food bowl sitting on the counter, maybe around 10 pounds. I grabbed it. For a brief second, I hesitated. Not because I didn't know what I needed to do, but because I wanted to make sure Gabby was okay with it. I looked at her, and she understood immediately. She said yes. That was all I needed. I swung the bowl and hit the attacking dog. Once. Twice. Again and again. Each hit was hard, deliberate, aimed at breaking its focus. I didn't count at the time, but later I realized it was probably around 7 or 8 strikes before it finally let go. When it did, it stepped back and disengaged. The room went from chaos to stillness in a matter of seconds. I grabbed the injured dog and rushed it out toward the treatment area. My hands were shaking, my heart racing, adrenaline still pumping through me. I was covered in blood, my clothes soaked, my arms smeared with it. I expected to walk into urgency. Instead, I walked into calm. People were standing around, listening to music, their radios turned down or off. It was like stepping into a completely different world, one where nothing had happened at all. The contrast was unreal. Later, one of the receptionists asked me about it. She said she had heard something over the radio, someone screaming, saying there was an emergency. But she had been with a client, and it was loud, so she turned the volume down. That was it. That was the moment where things really settled in. The realization that help had been there, just not listening. After everything was over, after the dogs were handled, and the immediate crisis passed, I was the one assigned to clean up the room. All of it. The blood on the walls, the floors, the surfaces. Every mark of what had just happened. And as I stood there, cleaning it up, going over the same spots again and again, it became clear that something had changed for me. Not just because of what I had seen, but because of how it had unfolded. The silence, the lack of response, the way something so extreme had been happening while everything else carried on like normal. I couldn't stay there after that. So I quit, just like that. Because some moments don't just pass. They stay with you. And they change how you see everything that comes after. It began in a way that probably didn't feel dangerous at all in the moment. Just something quiet, something hidden, something that stayed between two people. A young woman in the 1960s became involved with her boss. At that time, things like that already carried complications, but they were easier to keep out of sight. There were fewer ways for people to know, fewer ways for things to surface unless someone chose to bring them into the open. For her, it might have felt important. Maybe she believed there was something real there. Maybe she trusted him. Or maybe she was pulled into it slowly without fully thinking about where it would lead. For him, it was likely something he believed he could control. Something that could remain separate from the rest of his life. For a while, it stayed that way. Then she became pregnant. That changed everything. What had once been something hidden became something that couldn't be ignored. A pregnancy brings reality into a situation. It forces decisions, creates pressure, and brings the possibility that everything could be exposed. It's no longer just two people sharing a secret. It becomes something visible, something that has consequences. She threatened to tell his wife. From her side, that might have felt like the only way forward. Maybe she wanted him to take responsibility. Maybe she wanted honesty. Or maybe she was scared and didn't know what else to do. When someone feels cornered, they look for a way to make the situation real, to force it into the open where it can't be denied. But for him, that threat meant something entirely different. It meant exposure. It meant the collapse of everything he had built. His reputation, his family, the image he had created for himself. All of it was at risk. And instead of facing that, instead of dealing with the consequences of his own actions, he made a choice that cannot be undone. He killed her. One moment she was alive, carrying a child, still with a future ahead of her. The next, both her life and the life of her unborn child were taken. It's the kind of act that doesn't just end something, it erases it in a way that feels impossible to fully understand. But what came after is what makes the story even more unsettling. He didn't report it. He didn't make it disappear in a way that would remove it completely from his life. Instead, he kept her. He placed her body inside an industrial barrel, something heavy and solid, something meant to hold materials and keep them contained. And then he kept that barrel inside his home. For years. That detail changes the entire weight of the story. It means he lived with it. He walked past it. He knew exactly what was inside it every single day. It wasn't hidden far away. It wasn't buried somewhere distant. It was part of his environment, something that existed alongside his normal life. Days turned into months. Months turned into years. Time kept moving forward, and the secret stayed where it was. Eventually, the house changed hands. New people moved in, then others after them. Life continued in that space, completely unaware of what had been left behind. The barrel remained where it was, heavy, unremarkable, just another object that no one had a reason to question too deeply. People saw it, they noticed it. Maybe they wondered about it briefly, but they didn't open it. It stayed there through decades, untouched, silent. Until finally, in the 1990s, someone decided to get rid of it. Maybe it was part of cleaning out the house. Maybe it had become an inconvenience, something taking up space for no clear reason. Whatever the motivation, they made the decision to open it before disposing of it. And that's when everything came back. What had been hidden for so long was suddenly exposed. What had remained silent for decades was now impossible to ignore. Inside that barrel was something no one expected to find. Something that turned an ordinary moment into the beginning of an investigation. Authorities became involved, and the process of uncovering the truth began. Cases like that don't resolve quickly, especially after so much time has passed. But slowly, piece by piece, they started to understand what had happened. They identified the remains, built a timeline, and followed the connections that led back to the man she had been involved with all those years ago. Eventually, they found him. By then, he was older, living a life that had continued forward as if nothing had ever happened. The past had remained hidden, buried in a way that allowed him to move on without consequence. But now it had surfaced. When the evidence pointed directly to him, when it became clear that he was the father of the unborn child and the one responsible for her death, the truth closed in around him. There was no more distance, no more hiding. Before he could be arrested, before the process could fully play out, he made another decision. He took his own life. Just like that, the person responsible was gone. There was no trial, no full explanation, no chance to hear everything from his own words. But the truth itself remained. And then there is the part of the story that feels different from everything else. Her mother. By the time her daughter was found, she was in her late 80s. She had spent decades without knowing what had happened. No clear ending, no closure. Just the absence of someone she loved. That kind of not knowing changes a person. It leaves questions that don't fade, that stay in the background of every year that passes. When she was finally told that her daughter had been found, it brought a kind of closure, but not the kind anyone hopes for. It answered the question of what had happened, but it also confirmed the worst possible outcome. What she said afterward is what stays with people. She said that for years, she had been having dreams about her daughter being trapped inside a metal container, long before the truth was ever discovered. That detail is hard to place into something logical. It could be coincidence, the mind trying to make sense of loss through symbols and images. It could be something deeper, something emotional that found its way into dreams without any direct knowledge, or it could be something that doesn't fit neatly into explanation at all. Either way, it adds another layer to the story. Because even while the physical truth was hidden, something about it never fully disappeared. It remained in the background, in the absence, in the feeling that something wasn't right, even if no one could say why. Stories like this don't stay with people just because of what happened. They stay because of how long they remained hidden. Because of the idea that something so serious, something so final, could exist quietly in the same place where ordinary life continued. That a secret could sit there, unchanged, while years passed and people moved in and out without ever knowing. And when it finally comes to light, it doesn't just close the story. It opens it in a different way, because even with answers, there are still things that don't fully make sense. And those are the parts that stay with you the longest. It started like one of those late-night conversations that feels easy and familiar. A group of friends sitting together, drinks in hand, letting the night stretch out while stories and memories come and go. It's the kind of setting where people start looking back without really planning to, where one small mention turns into another, and suddenly you're all talking about people you haven't thought about in years. Someone brings up a name. At first, it's nothing serious, just a passing thought, almost like a random memory that surfaces without warning. Someone else recognizes it, laughs a little, and then the question comes up in that casual way it always does. Whatever happened to that guy? In this case, it was someone you all remembered from high school. Not someone especially close, not someone who stood out in a major way. Just a familiar face from an aid period. The kind of person you see often enough to recognize, maybe exchange a few words with now and then, but not someone who stays in your life after school ends. He was just there for a while, part of that shared routine. And then, like most people, he faded out of it once everything moved on. When people started talking about him, the general feeling was the same across the group. He was a nice kid. Quiet, maybe, but not in a strange way. Just normal. No stories about trouble. No moments that stood out as concerning. Nothing that would make anyone think twice about him. He was just a regular person. That's what made the question feel so harmless. Someone pulled out their phone the way people do now without thinking. It was just curiosity. A quick search, maybe a social media profile. Maybe a small update about where he ended up. Something simple that would give the conversation a quick answer before moving on to something else. But that's not what came up. Instead of the usual results, there were legal documents, appellate court records. At first, it didn't really register. It's not the kind of thing you expect to see when you look up someone from school. It feels out of place, like maybe it's the wrong person or some kind of mistake. But then you start reading, and the tone of the night begins to change. Slowly at first, as the details start to come together. After high school, he had joined the military. He had gone overseas, into a place most people only ever hear about through news or secondhand stories. Afghanistan. A completely different environment from anything you all experienced growing up. A place where things happen that don't easily translate back into normal life. According to the records, whatever he went through there didn't stay there. It came back with him. The documents described it in a clinical way, but even through that kind of language, the weight of it was clear. He had seen things that deeply affected him. Not just in a temporary way, not something he could process and move past over time, but something that changed him at a fundamental level. He came back with severe trauma, PTSD, and alongside that, something even more difficult to understand. delusional schizophrenia. That's the point where the story becomes harder to take in, because it's no longer just about someone struggling after a difficult experience. It's about a complete shift in how they understand reality, the way they see the world, and the way they interpret what's happening around them. Everything changes. And once that happens, things don't always follow a path that makes sense from the outside. The court records described a pattern that was both confusing and deeply unsettling. He believed that his mother was in danger, not in a normal sense, not from something real and visible, but from something he believed was real in his own mind. He thought there were demons around her, something threatening her in a way no one else could see. And in his mind, the only way to protect her was to do something unthinkable. He believed that if he killed her, she would go somewhere safe, somewhere beyond the reach of whatever he thought was after her. To him, it wasn't harm. It was protection. He had tried to do it, more than once. Each time it failed. But the belief didn't go away. It stayed unchanged, because it wasn't based on logic that could be reasoned with. It was something deeper, something fixed in the way he was experiencing reality. Reading that changes everything about the way you remember him. The quiet kid, the normal moments, the small interactions that never meant much at the time. All of it feels distant now, almost disconnected from what you're reading. But then it goes even further. Someone looks him up on social media. And that's when it stops feeling like a distant story. Because now it's not just legal language or summaries of events. It's his own words, his own thoughts, written out in real time. Posts that don't follow a clear pattern. Long messages that jump from one idea to another. References to things that don't make sense from the outside, but clearly mean something to him. Mentions of demons, of danger, of things that aren't there, but feel completely real to him. There's no structure to it, no filter, just a stream of thoughts that shows how far things have shifted. And that's when it really hits, because it's no longer abstract. It's not just something that happened to someone in a distant way. It's someone you knew, even if only a little, even if only for a short time. That small connection is enough to make it feel personal. There's a sadness in that realization. Seeing someone who started in the same place, who shared the same environment, end up in a situation like that. It's not something that feels fair or easy to accept. It doesn't fit into the way people expect life to go. But alongside that sadness, there's another feeling. Something quieter but harder to ignore. A kind of unease. Not necessarily fear of him as a person, but fear of the idea behind it. The realization that someone can change that much, that quickly, that completely. It challenges something people like to believe about the world, that there's a clear line between what's normal and what isn't, that people stay within certain boundaries, that change happens slowly, predictably, in ways that can be understood. But this doesn't fit that. This shows how fragile that sense of normal can be, how much it can depend on circumstances, on experiences, on things that happen to someone that others never see or fully understand. It makes you look back at the version of him you knew and wonder if there was anything there, any small sign, any hint of what might come later. But most of the time, there isn't. Most of the time, everything seemed completely normal. And that's what makes it harder to process. Because it means there was nothing obvious to point to, nothing that could have predicted this outcome. The conversation that night probably didn't feel the same after that. What started as something light, something nostalgic, turned into something heavier. Something that stayed in the background even as the conversation moved on to other topics. Because it wasn't just about finding out what happened to someone, it was about understanding how much a person can change, how quickly things can shift under the right circumstances, and how sometimes the distance between who someone was and who they become isn't as large as people think. That realization doesn't go away easily. It stays there, quietly, changing the way you think about people, about experiences, about the things that shape who someone becomes. Not in a way that makes you afraid of everyone, but in a way that makes you aware of how much can exist beneath the surface, and how sometimes you never really see it until much later. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. It started as one of those completely normal school days, the kind that blends in with every other day without leaving any real mark. Nothing about the morning felt different. The classroom looked the same group of students sitting in the same seats, half paying attention and half just waiting for time to pass. By 10th grade, everything had become predictable. You knew how the day would go before it even started. The routine didn't change much. Walk in, sit down, listen for a bit, drift off a little, then repeat until the bell rang. It wasn't exciting, but it was familiar, and that familiarity made everything feel safe in a quiet way. Our teacher had a habit that a lot of teachers seem to have. At the start of class, instead of jumping straight into the lesson, they would go around the room and ask everyone how their weekend was. It was never meant to be anything serious. Just a simple way to get people talking, to ease into the day. Most of the time, it was exactly what you'd expect. People talked about hanging out with friends, playing games, watching movies, or doing nothing at all. Some people gave short answers. Some tried to be funny, but it never went anywhere deep. It was just small talk. Something you didn't really think about. That day started the same way. The teacher began going around the room, one student at a time. Each person gave their answer, and it all blended together. Nothing stood out. Nothing felt important. Just the usual mix of ordinary stories. Then it reached her. She was the quietest girl in the class. The kind of person who stayed in the background, never drawing attention to herself. She didn't talk much, and when she did, it was usually only a few words. You could sit in the same room as her for weeks and barely hear her speak. She wasn't part of any group that stood out. She just kept to herself, like she was always trying not to be noticed. When it became her turn, no one expected anything different. Maybe a short answer, maybe just nothing, or it was fine. Something simple so the teacher could move on to the next person. But that's not what happened. She started to speak, and at first it sounded normal. Her voice was quiet, like always, soft enough that you had to pay attention to hear it. But then something changed. There was a break in her voice, something unsteady. Before anyone really understood what was happening, she started crying. Not the kind of crying someone tries to hide. Not silent tears or looking down at the desk. It was sudden and real, like whatever she had been holding inside just came out all at once. The entire room changed in that moment. All the small conversations stopped. People looked up. The normal feeling of the classroom disappeared almost instantly. It was like everything had paused and no one knew what to do next. The teacher looked surprised, concerned, but even they didn't seem prepared for something like this. It wasn't the kind of response anyone expected from a simple question about the weekend. Through her crying, she tried to speak. It was hard for her to get the words out. She had to stop and start again, trying to explain what had happened. She said she had gone on a trip with her mom to the mountains. At first, it sounded like the beginning of a normal story. People go on trips all the time. It could have been anything. But the way she was speaking, the way her voice kept breaking, made it clear that this wasn't going to be a normal story. She said they had stopped somewhere along the way, and for some reason she looked over the edge of a cliff. That's when she saw it. At first it didn't fully make sense to her. From a distance, something like that can look strange, almost unreal, like your brain doesn't want to accept what it's seeing right away. But then she looked closer, and she understood. There was a car down below, overturned, completely wrecked. And around it there were people, a family. They weren't moving. They weren't reacting. They were just lying there, still. She said they were dead. Hearing that in a classroom, in the middle of what was supposed to be a normal conversation, felt wrong. Like something had been dropped into the room that didn't belong there. It didn't fit the moment, didn't match the setting. No one said anything. There wasn't anything to say. Most of us had never seen something like that in real life. Maybe on TV or in movies, but that's different. There's always a distance there, something that makes it easier to separate yourself from it. This was real, and it had happened to someone sitting right there in the room. The image alone was enough to make it hard to think clearly. An overturned car at the bottom of a cliff, a family inside it. The realization that it must have happened recently, that she hadn't just heard about it, but had seen it with her own eyes. It was the kind of thing your mind doesn't know how to process. For her, it wasn't just a story. She had been there. She had looked down and seen it. That's what made it different. Seeing something like that without warning can stay with you in a way that's hard to explain. Your brain tries to understand it, tries to make sense of it. But at the same time, it doesn't want to accept it. So it gets stuck. And that's what it looked like was happening to her. She wasn't just telling us what happened. She was reliving it. Every word came out with emotion, like she was still standing there, still looking over that edge, still trying to understand what she had seen. The classroom didn't feel the same after that. The normal routine was gone. The teacher didn't continue asking people about their weekends. There was no point anymore. That question had already led somewhere no one expected. Instead, everything slowed down. The teacher tried to comfort her, speaking gently, giving her time to breathe. Some students looked away because they didn't know how to react. Others just stared, trying to take it in. For most of us, it was the first time something like that had come into our lives in a real way. Not through a screen, not as a story, but through someone who had actually seen it. That's what made it stay. Even after the class ended, even after the day continued like nothing had happened, that moment didn't fade. It stayed clear in a way most school memories don't. Because it wasn't just another day, it was a reminder that things can change without warning. That something normal, like a weekend trip, can turn into something you can't unsee. And that sometimes you don't even have to experience something directly for it to affect you. Just hearing it, just imagining it, just seeing the way it affected someone else is enough. Even now, that moment still feels clear. Not because you want to remember it, but because your mind doesn't fully know how to let it go. It's the kind of story that doesn't feel serious at the beginning. When you first hear it, It sounds simple, almost ordinary, the kind of situation that happens every day in homes everywhere without anyone thinking twice about it. A coworker's dad was watching his baby grandson for the day. There was nothing unusual about that. It was just family helping family. Grandparents stepping in, spending time with the baby, giving the parents a bit of rest. It's something that feels safe by default, something people trust without question. That day started like any other. The house was quiet. The baby was likely in his room, maybe sleeping, maybe just lying there, doing what babies do. There was no reason to expect anything to go wrong. Nothing out of place, nothing that would have made anyone feel uneasy. At some point, the grandfather decided to check on him. And that's a normal instinct. When a baby has been quiet for a while, you go take a look. Not because you expect danger, but because you want to make sure everything's okay. Maybe adjust a blanket. Maybe just see that they're still sleeping peacefully. But when he walked into that room, everything changed in an instant. The baby had somehow reached the cord from the window blinds. It's the kind of detail people don't think about. The cord is just there, part of the room, something you see every day without noticing. It doesn't look dangerous. It doesn't feel like something that could cause harm, especially in a space that's meant to be safe for a child. But babies grab things. They reach for whatever is near them, especially as they start becoming more aware of their surroundings. They don't understand risk. They don't know what's safe and what isn't. Somehow he had gotten tangled in it. Not just lightly caught, but enough for it to wrap around his neck and tighten. Enough to stop him from breathing properly. Enough to turn something ordinary into something life-threatening. By the time the grandfather saw him, it was already serious. The baby had turned blue. Now, that's not a small detail. It means oxygen had already been cut off for long enough to cause visible damage. His body had been struggling, his system under stress, trying to get air and failing. The veins in his face had burst. That shows how much pressure had built up, how intense those moments had been before anyone got there. This wasn't something that had just started seconds ago. It had been happening long enough to become critical. That's the part that makes it so hard to think about. The idea that something so small, something so normal, could turn into something so dangerous without anyone realizing it right away. The grandfather panicked. There's no other way to react in a moment like that. No calm thinking, no step-by-step process. Just fear and urgency hitting all at once. He called 911. Those moments waiting for help must have felt endless. Even if it was only a few minutes, time stretches in situations like that. Every second feels heavier, filled with the thought that it might already be too late. But help came quickly. Emergency responders arrived within minutes. That timing made all the difference. They were able to reach the baby, intervene, and bring him back. That doesn't always happen in situations like that, especially when breathing has been cut off. In many cases, the outcome is much worse. But this time, it wasn't. He survived. Not just barely, but enough that he recovered and went on to live a normal life. That's what changes the entire story. Without that part, it would be something much darker. Instead, it becomes something that still feels terrifying, but with an ending that brings a kind of relief. When they got to the hospital, though, things didn't settle right away. The parents and the grandfather were separated and questioned. That can feel harsh, especially in a moment when everyone is already shaken. But it's part of how these situations are handled. When a child comes in with injuries like that, especially something involving the neck, it raises serious concerns. And medical staff and authorities have to make sure it wasn't intentional. They have to understand exactly what happened, so they ask questions. again and again, trying to piece together the timeline, making sure everything lines up. It can feel like being suspected, like being blamed even when you know it was an accident. But in the end, that's what it was, a terrible accident. One of those moments where something ordinary becomes dangerous in a way no one expected. The baby grew up. He's now in his 20s, living a normal life, completely okay. That part almost feels disconnected from the rest of the story. It's hard to believe that something so serious, something that came so close to ending differently, is now just something in the past. He probably doesn't even remember it. But for the people who were there, it's different. For the grandfather, that moment likely never left him. Walking into that room, seeing what he saw, realizing what was happening, that's not something you forget easily. For the parents, it's the same. Knowing how close it came, knowing how quickly things could have gone another way. That kind of realization stays. It also changes how you see everyday things. Objects that seem harmless don't feel the same anymore. Cords, blinds, anything within reach of a child, they suddenly stand out in a different way. You start noticing where they are, how they're positioned, whether they could become a risk. Because before something like this, you don't think about it. Afterward, you do. That's why stories like this matter. Not because they're meant to scare, but because they show how easily something can be overlooked. How safety isn't always about obvious dangers, but sometimes about the small things that don't seem dangerous until they are. And in this case, it ended the best way it could. He survived. He grew up. And the story becomes something that stays with the people who know it, not just as something frightening, but as a reminder to pay attention to the details that usually go unnoticed. Because sometimes those small details are the ones that matter the most. It didn't feel real at the beginning because everything about it sounded so normal. Living in a big house with a lot of people comes with a kind of everyday chaos that you slowly get used to. Things go missing all the time. Food disappears from the fridge. Items get moved from one place to another, and no one really questions it. Because there are so many people coming and going that it just blends into daily life. After a while, that chaos becomes your version of normal. I was living in a sorority house with around 20 other women. It was an old place, the kind of house that had clearly been there for years and hadn't been taken care of the way it should have been. There were small problems everywhere. Floors that creaked with every step, doors that didn't close properly, had corners that looked like no one had cleaned them in a long time. It wasn't the kind of old that felt warm or comforting. It just felt worn out. The basement was the worst part of the house. No one went down there unless they absolutely had to. It was mostly used for laundry, and even that felt like something you wanted to finish as quickly as possible. Over time, people had left things behind, boxes, old furniture, random belongings that no one claimed anymore. It all built up into piles that just stayed there, like everyone had silently agreed not to deal with it. It looked messy, but not unusual. In a house like that, mess doesn't stand out. If something is out of place, you assume someone else moved it. If something is gone, you assume someone took it. If food disappears, you don't question it. You just accept it and move on. That's what made everything so easy to miss. At some point, without any of us realizing it, a man had been living in that basement. No one knew how long he had been there. It could have been days, maybe even longer. There wasn't a clear moment where something went wrong. Everything just blended into the normal confusion of the house. Looking back, it makes sense why he chose that place. A house full of people, constant movement, no real system of keeping track of anything. It was the perfect environment for someone to stay hidden. No one would notice one extra presence when everything already felt disorganized. The only reason anyone found out was because of something small. One day, one of the girls went down to the basement to do her laundry. It was just another routine moment, something she had done many times before without thinking about it. But that day was different. As she was down there, she noticed something behind the piles of old things. At first, it probably didn't make sense. Just something slightly out of place, something that didn't match the rest of the clutter. Then she looked closer. There was a bed. Not an old mattress someone had thrown away, but something set up in a way that showed it was being used. That alone felt wrong, because no one was supposed to be living down there. And then she saw him. A man. Just there, in the basement, in a space that was supposed to be empty except for storage and laundry. That's the moment everything changes. Because until that second, the house felt familiar, even with all its problems. But suddenly, there was someone there who didn't belong. Someone who had been sharing that space without anyone knowing. He tried to explain himself. He said he was dating one of the girls in the house, that he had been drinking, got confused, and ended up in the basement by accident. It was the kind of story that might sound believable if you didn't already know what you were looking at. But it didn't make sense. A bed doesn't just appear because someone got lost for a night. There was more to it. She didn't argue with him or try to figure it out on her own. She called campus police. That decision changed everything. When they came and looked at the situation, it became clear that this wasn't just a mistake. He hadn't wandered in and stayed for one night. He had been living there for some time. They later explained that he had likely been using a separate entrance to the basement to come and go without being seen. That's what made it possible. He didn't have to pass through the main areas of the house where people would notice him. He had his own way in and out. And because everything else in the house already felt unstructured, no one realized what was happening. That's what makes it so unsettling. Not just that he was there, but that he could be there for that long without anyone noticing. It changes how you see the space. The basement isn't just messy anymore. It becomes something else entirely. A place that was being used in a way no one expected. When you think back, small things start to feel different. Food going missing, items being moved. Moments that didn't seem important at the time, but now feel like they might have meant something. Even simple sounds might take on a different meaning when you look back on them. I don't even remember if they caught him. It's been years, and some details have faded. But the feeling hasn't completely gone away. That awareness that someone had been there, living in the same house, moving in and out, existing just out of sight. It stays with you. Because it shows how easy it is to miss something when you're used to chaos. When your environment already feels unpredictable, it becomes harder to notice when something truly doesn't belong. After that, the house didn't feel the same. Even if everything went back to normal on the surface, even if nothing else happened, there was always that thought in the background, that someone had been there, that they had been close, and that no one knew until it was already happening. It makes you think about how many small things we ignore every day. How often we explain things away because they fit into what we already expect. A missing item, a strange sound, something slightly out of place. Most of the time, those things don't mean anything, but sometimes they do. And the difference between the two isn't always clear in the moment. That's what makes it linger. Not just the fact that he was there, but how easily it was hidden. How normal everything felt while it was happening. How nothing stood out enough to make anyone question it, until it was right in front of someone. And then it was impossible to ignore. That kind of realization doesn't go away quickly. It changes the way you look at spaces, especially shared ones. It makes you more aware of who belongs and who doesn't. More aware of the small details you used to overlook. Not in a way that takes over your life, but in a way that stays quietly in the background. Because once you understand how something like that can happen, you don't fully go back to seeing things the same way again. And that's what makes a story like this stay. Not just what happened, but how normal everything felt while it was happening, and how close it was without anyone knowing. For about a year, I lived in a shared house with 4 other people. It was one of those places that never really felt fully organized, but after a while, you stop noticing that. Everyone had their own routines, their own habits, and over time, it all blended together into something that felt normal, even if it wasn't perfect. The house itself was fairly big, and one of the main things about it was the backyard. It wasn't just a small patch of space either. It stretched out quite far, with a garage and a separate tool shed sitting further back. The tool shed was the strangest part of it. None of us used it, not once. It just sat there, like part of the background, something you saw every day but never really thought about. We also had motion detector lights outside. At first, those lights felt like a good thing. They gave a sense of security. If anything moved out there, the lights would turn on. It made the place feel protected, like nothing could really happen without us knowing. But after a while, those lights started going off at random. Sometimes it would happen late at night, when everything was quiet. Sometimes it would happen when no one was outside at all. The yard would suddenly light up for no clear reason, and then go dark again. To me, it seemed simple. Animals. That was the easiest explanation. Cats, maybe raccoons. Something small moving through the yard and setting off the sensor. It made sense, so I didn't think about it too much. It didn't feel like something worth questioning. But 2 of my housemates didn't see it that way. They were really into anything supernatural. Ghosts, spirits, all of that. They believed in it fully. On top of that, they experimented with different substances, so their way of interpreting things wasn't always grounded in logic. For them, the lights weren't just lights. They were signs. They became convinced that something was out there. Not an animal, not something ordinary, but something else. Something they couldn't clearly see but felt was present. One of them even said she had seen it. She told us she saw a man standing outside looking through the window. She described him like a shadow, a figure that didn't fully belong there. The way she spoke about it, she seemed completely sure of what she had seen. But she had been high at the time, on mushrooms. So to me, it didn't feel real. It sounded like something her mind created in that state. I didn't take it seriously. It just felt like one of those stories that grows out of imagination and belief. Still, they kept talking about it. The idea of a ghost became a regular topic in the house. Every time the lights went off, it confirmed what they already believed. Every small sound, every strange moment, it all added to that idea. For them, it was something real. For me, it was nothing. Just background noise. A few nights later, something happened that I didn't think much of at the time, but it stayed with me in a quiet way. I had been drinking that night. Not completely out of control, but enough that things felt a little slower, a little less clear. I went toward the back of the house, near the mesh door that looked out into the yard, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone, a man, standing out there. It wasn't clear, not detailed, just a shape, a figure in the darkness, something that didn't belong. But I didn't react. I didn't question it. I told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. It made sense at the time. I had been drinking, and my housemates had been talking about this ghost constantly. It was easy to believe my brain had just filled in the gaps, created something out of suggestion and imagination. So I ignored it. I didn't go outside. I didn't check. I just moved on like nothing had happened. At the time, it felt like the right decision. Looking back, it feels different. Time passed, and eventually, I moved out of that house. I went back to my home country, and life moved forward. The house became just another place I used to live, something that faded into memory. Until about 6 months later, I was on a FaceTime call with one of my old housemates. We were just talking normally at first, catching up, nothing serious. Then the conversation shifted, and she mentioned something that immediately caught my attention. She told me it hadn't been a ghost. There had been a man living in our backyard, in the Toolshed, a homeless man. No one knew exactly how long he had been there. It could have been weeks, maybe even months. There was no clear moment when he arrived. He had just been there quietly, without anyone noticing, living in that space, using it as shelter. That's when everything started to make sense. The lights, the movement, the feeling that something was out there. It had all been real, just not in the way anyone thought. There was no ghost. There was a person. Someone living just a short distance away from us, moving around at night, staying hidden during the day, existing right there without us realizing it. And then that moment came back to me. The night I thought I saw someone through the mesh door. That figure, that shape. It hadn't been my imagination. That's the part that really stayed with me. Not just that he was there, but that I had seen him. Even if only for a second. Even if I didn't understand it at the time. I had looked right at him and convinced myself it wasn't real. That realization changes everything. Because it means he had been close. Closer than any of us realized. Moving around the yard, using the tool shed, triggering the lights, possibly watching the house without being seen. All of it happening while we lived our lives, completely unaware. It creates a strange feeling when you think about it. Not fear in the moment, because that moment is gone, but something else. A delayed understanding. The realization that something had been happening right in front of you, and you didn't recognize it for what it was. It makes you think about how easy it is to miss things, how often we explain things in ways that fit what we already believe. My housemates thought it was something supernatural. I thought it was nothing at all. Neither of us saw the truth. And the truth was simple, but also unsettling in its own way. A real person, living there, right next to us. And we had no idea. After that, I started thinking about all the small details we ignored. The times the lights came on and no one checked. The sounds that didn't quite make sense but were brushed off. The way the tool shed just existed without ever being questioned. It wasn't hidden in some impossible way. It was just overlooked. And that's what makes it stay with me. Not because something happened directly to me, but because something was there the entire time. Close enough to see, close enough to notice, and I still convinced myself it wasn't real. That's the part that lingers. Not the idea of danger itself, but the realization of how easily it can exist without being seen. I remember that day in a way that still feels clear, even though I was very young at the time. I must have been around 7 years old, and my cousin was about the same age. It was one of those ordinary days that didn't feel important at all while it was happening. Nothing unusual, nothing that would make you think something was about to go wrong. We were at my parents' house, a place that always felt safe to me. The house sat at the top of a hill, a little removed from everything else. The driveway stretched down for what felt like forever, about half a mile long, winding its way down to the road. From the house, you could see a good distance, especially from the front windows. It was quiet there most of the time. Not the kind of quiet that feels strange, but the kind that feels normal when you're used to it. Inside, everything felt calm. My mom was in the bathroom taking a bath, and my cousin and I were in the living room doing what kids usually do at that age. We were sitting in front of the TV, not really thinking about anything beyond whatever we were watching. The kind of simple, distracted focus that comes easily when you're a kid. I was sitting in a spot where I could see the front door clearly. It was directly in front of me, part of the background more than anything else. I wasn't paying attention to it. It was just there. My cousin was sitting off to the side where the door would have been in her peripheral vision, not something she would notice unless she turned her head. At some point, without any warning, the door moved. It opened. At first, it didn't even register in a dramatic way. It was just motion. Something shifting in a place that usually stayed still. But then I saw him. A man stepped inside. He wasn't someone I recognized. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Even as a kid, you know the people who are supposed to be in your home. Family, friends, familiar faces. This wasn't any of those. He was holding something in his hand. A large knife. At that age, I didn't have the words to describe it properly. I just knew it was big. Bigger than anything I'd seen someone carry casually. It didn't look like something that belonged inside a house. It didn't match the normal feeling of everything around me. For a moment, everything felt still. We looked at each other. It wasn't a long moment, but it was enough. Enough for me to understand that something wasn't right, even if I couldn't fully explain why. There was something in the way he stood there, something in the fact that he had come in without saying anything. I called out to my cousin. I don't even remember exactly what I said, just that I needed her to look, to see what I was seeing. My voice must have sounded different because she reacted immediately. She started to get up, turning toward the door, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man turned and ran. He didn't say anything. He didn't come further inside. He didn't hesitate. He just moved fast, heading back out the way he had come. Down the porch steps, away from the house. For a second, I didn't move. It was like my mind was trying to catch up with what had just happened. But then everything started moving at once. I ran to the bathroom. I remember pushing the door open and calling out to my mom, trying to explain what I had seen. The words probably didn't come out clearly. I was a kid, and I was scared, and I was trying to describe something I didn't fully understand. But she understood enough. She got out of the bath immediately. She didn't stop to dry off or get dressed. She came out just as she was, water and soap still on her, reacting in that instant way that only happens when something feels urgent and serious. All three of us moved toward the windows that faced down the hill. From there, you could see the driveway clearly as it stretched away from the house. And that's where we saw him again. He was running, fast, heading down the long driveway toward a car that had been parked further away, out of sight from the house itself. He still had the knife in his hand, and even from that distance, it was clear how large it was. He reached the car, got in, and was gone. The whole thing had taken only a few moments, but it didn't feel that way. It felt longer, stretched out by how sudden and confusing it had been. My mom called the police. I remember hearing her voice as she explained what had happened. She used a word I didn't understand at the time. She said the man had a machete. Back then, it didn't mean anything to me. It was just another word mixed into a situation that already didn't make sense. It wasn't until years later that I understood what that word meant. That the knife I had seen wasn't just large, but something more specific. Something meant for cutting in a way that made the situation feel even more serious in hindsight. The police came, of course. They asked questions, tried to piece together what had happened. But there wasn't much to go on. The man had come and gone quickly. He hadn't said anything. He hadn't stayed long enough for anyone to understand why he was there. That's the part that stayed with me the most over time. Not just that it happened, but how little sense it made. As a kid, you don't always process fear the same way adults do. At the time, it was confusing more than anything else. It didn't fully settle in right away. But as I got older, I started to think about it differently. I started to understand what could have happened. The distance of the house, the long driveway, the fact that my mom was alone with 2 kids, the way he walked in without hesitation, already holding that weapon. And then the way he left. That's the part that never fully made sense. Why did he stop? Why did he turn around the moment he saw us? It's hard to believe that 2 small kids scared him off. That doesn't feel like a strong enough reason on its own. But something changed in that moment. Something about being seen, about making eye contact, about the situation no longer being completely under his control. Maybe he hadn't expected anyone to be in that room. Maybe he thought the house was empty, or that he could move through it unnoticed. And the moment that changed, the moment he realized he had been seen, his plan fell apart. Or maybe there was something else, something we'll never know. That uncertainty is what lingers, because nothing actually happened in the way it could have. There was no direct harm, no confrontation, beyond that brief moment. But the possibility of what could have happened stays in the background, quiet but constant. Even now, I can still picture it. The door opening, the man stepping inside, the brief moment where everything paused, and then the sudden movement as he turned and ran. It's strange how something so short can stay with you for so long. How a moment that lasted only seconds can take on more meaning over time as you understand it better. Back then, it was just something scary that happened. Now it feels like something much closer than that. Something that almost happened. Something that could have gone very differently. And the fact that it didn't is the only reason it remains just a story, instead of something much worse. My dad has told this story so many times over the years that it almost feels like one of my own memories now. It's one of those stories that never really fades, no matter how much time passes. Even when you try not to think about it, it sits somewhere in the back of your mind, quiet but always there. And every time he tells it, the feeling is the same. That slow, creeping unease that builds without you even realizing it. He grew up in Michigan, in an area that wasn't exactly busy or crowded. It was the kind of place where things were spread out, where you had long stretches of road with nothing but trees on either side. Not the kind of place you'd expect something strange to happen. But maybe that's exactly why it stayed with him the way it did. Somewhere out there, and far enough away from everything that most people didn't even think about it, there was an old, abandoned insane asylum. It had been shut down long before my dad and his friends were old enough to understand what it really was. By the time they were in high school, it was already just a place people talked about, a place with stories, the kind of place that teenagers dared each other to visit, especially at night. The building itself was mostly gone by then, or at least that's what people said. Broken walls, empty windows, pieces of it falling apart slowly over time. But what made it different from any other abandoned place was what was underneath it. There were tunnels, old underground tunnels that had once been used for things no one was really sure about anymore. Maybe for maintenance, maybe for moving patients without being seen, maybe for something else entirely. No one knew for sure, and that only made it more interesting. My dad and his friends had heard about those tunnels for a long time, before they ever decided to go out there. It wasn't something they planned seriously at first. Just talk. Something to bring up when they were bored, when they wanted to scare each other a little. But eventually, like most things at that age, it turned into a real plan. One night, they decided to go. They waited until it was late. The kind of late where most people are already asleep and the roads feel empty in a way that makes everything seem a little more distant. My dad said the drive out there felt longer than it actually was. Not because of the distance, but because of the silence. No music, no real conversation. Just the quiet understanding that they were about to do something they probably shouldn't. When they finally reached the place, it didn't look like much at first. Just darkness and shapes that didn't fully make sense until your eyes adjusted. The remains of the building stood there, broken and still, like it had been forgotten by everything around it. Even the air felt different, heavier somehow. They didn't stay above ground for long. The entrance to the tunnels wasn't obvious, but they had heard enough about it to find it. It was hidden in a way that made it feel more real, more serious. Like once you went down there, you were stepping into something separate from everything else. My dad said the moment they entered the tunnel, the feeling changed completely. It was colder down there, and the air felt damp. Every sound echoed in a way that made it hard to tell where anything was coming from. Even their footsteps sounded louder than they should have, bouncing off the walls and coming back to them in strange ways. The light they had with them didn't go very far. It showed just enough to see where they were stepping, but beyond that, it was all shadow. At first, they stayed close together, talking a little, laughing in that nervous way people do when they're trying to act like they're not scared. But the deeper they went, the quieter they became. The tunnel didn't stay the same the whole way. After a while, they came to a part that looked different. It was partially collapsed. Dirt and rubble had filled most of the path, making it impossible to just walk through. The tunnel narrowed there, and it felt like the space itself was closing in. But there was one way through. At the top, just below where the tunnel curved, there was a small opening. Not big enough to stand through, not even big enough to crouch through comfortably. You had to crawl. That's where everything slowed down. They stood there for a while, just looking at it. No one wanted to be the first to say they didn't want to go through, but at the same time, no one really wanted to be the one to try it either. Eventually, one of the guys stepped forward. My dad never liked saying his name when he told the story. He would always just refer to him as one of the guys, like saying more would somehow make it worse. He said he would go through. At first, it seemed like he was just trying to prove something, like he didn't want to look scared in front of the others. But there was something else, too. Something in the way he said it, like he had already made up his mind. The others didn't try too hard to stop him. Maybe they should have, but at that age, things don't always feel as serious as they are. It just felt like part of the moment, part of the story they would tell later. He climbed up carefully, pulling himself toward the opening. The dirt shifted a little under his weight, small pieces falling down as he moved. Then he started to crawl through. For a few seconds, they could still see him. His legs, then just his feet. And then he was gone. At first, nothing felt wrong. They expected him to come back quickly, maybe laughing, maybe telling them it wasn't worth it. So they waited. A minute passed, then another. Someone called out to him. No answer. They called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The tunnel felt quieter than before. Not just quiet in the normal sense, but heavy. Like the silence itself had weight to it. Time started to stretch. My dad said it's hard to explain how long they waited. It could have been 10 minutes. It could have been longer. When you're standing in a place like that, time doesn't feel normal. Eventually, the feeling changed. It wasn't just that he wasn't coming back. It was the realization that something wasn't right. That whatever was on the other side of that crawl space wasn't something they understood. They tried calling again, one last time. Nothing. That's when they decided to leave. They didn't say it out loud at first. It was more like an unspoken agreement. One of them turned and the others followed. No one wanted to be the one to suggest going back through that opening. The walk back felt different. Faster, but also heavier. Like something was behind them, even if they couldn't see it. No one talked much. The only sound was their footsteps and the echo that followed. When they reached the entrance to the tunnel, they expected relief. Instead, they stopped. There were people outside, a lot of people. My dad said it didn't make sense. It was the middle of the night, far away from anything. There was no reason for anyone to be there, let alone a large group. At first, they just stood there trying to understand what they were seeing. The people weren't moving normally. They were just there, standing, facing the tunnel entrance. And then, almost all at once, they started screaming. Not yelling words, not shouting anything that made sense, just screaming. The sound filled everything. My dad said it was the kind of sound that didn't feel human. Not in the way people usually mean that, but in a way that made it hard to believe it was coming from normal people. Everything happened quickly after that. Someone turned and ran, then another. And then all of them were running, in different directions at first, before finding their way back toward where the car was. No one looked back. They just ran. Branches snapping under their feet, breath coming fast, hearts pounding so hard it felt like it might not stop. The screaming followed them for a while, or at least it felt like it did. When they finally reached the car, they didn't waste a second. They got in, started it, and left as fast as they could. No one spoke during the drive back. Not at first. It wasn't until they were far enough away that the questions started. A quiet at first, then louder, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But there were no answers. And then there was the part that made everything worse. The friend who had crawled through the opening called them later. My dad said he sounded different. Not just scared, but shaken in a way that didn't match anything they had experienced. He asked them why they left. They tried to explain, talking over each other, trying to describe the people, the screaming, everything. But when they asked him what he saw on the other side, he went quiet, completely quiet. They kept asking, but he refused to answer. Not just that night, but every time after that. He never told them what he saw. And then, not long after, he was killed. No clear reason, no explanation that made sense. It was sudden, and it didn't feel connected to anything in his life that people knew about. The person who did it was never found. My dad doesn't tell this story often, but when he does, there's always the same part that lingers. Not the tunnels, not even the people outside. It's the silence from his friend. The way he chose not to say anything at all about what he saw. Like whatever was on the other side of that crawl space wasn't something that could be put into words, or maybe something that shouldn't be. And that's the part that has stayed with me my entire life. Because sometimes the things people don't say are a lot more frightening than the things they do. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.